This week, History Hit has been getting up close with American history. I've come to the historic town of Camden in South Carolina, and I'm here to witness a truly remarkable service. The laying to rest of soldiers killed in battle here 240 years ago. Men from both sides who fell during the American Revolutionary War, the war that made the modern USA. In this special film, I experienced the commemorations at first hand.
These men were not given their due respect.
And I discovered the incredible work that has taken place to reinterpret the battlefield.
We soon realized this was potentially a mass grave.
And investigate and care for the bones of the fallen. In 1780, Camden found itself at the heart of the American story. Not just because it was a key strategic stopping off point on the Great Wagon Road, which carried settlers from Philadelphia, 600 miles that way, to new colonial territories on the frontier in the south, but because in the summer of that year, it was teeming with soldiers. The American Revolution had broken out 5 years earlier. The major pitched battles had mostly happened further north, but all 13 of the American colonies were in uproar. Fighting in Georgia, Virginia, and the Carolinas was intensifying in a battle to control these valuable and strategic southern colonies. In 1780, the forerunner of this road was the main route through the forested interior. American Continental Forces gathered in North Carolina, where they were joined by local militia. They quickly pressed south towards Camden, more militiamen joining along the way. The Revolutionary forces were heading hard down this road into the heart of South Carolina. They were here because the British were back. After years of the British fighting the Revolutionary forces in the northern states like New York and New Jersey, they'd switched their attention to the south. The year before, they'd captured Georgia, and now, in the spring of 1780, they'd taken South Carolina's most prominent city, Charleston. The Revolutionary forces marching on this road under General Gates were here to try and push the British back into the sea. The Revolutionary Army for this southern campaign was originally under the command of General Johann de Kalb. He had vast amounts of experience fighting with the French army in Europe and was now on the side of the American Revolution. But he was surprised when General Horatio Gates arrived and took ultimate command of this drive south. General Gates had been advised by almost all of his subordinate officers not to take this route into South Carolina. There was very little farmland, very little ability for the army to forage on the way. Food would be scarce. Also, it was famous for having lots of loyalists. Lots of loyal Americans who didn't approve of the revolution. They'd be marching through a nest of enemies and spies. Gates's bold move to press south came to a head here on the night of the 15th of August, in these very woods, about 8 miles north of Camden. Horatio Gates was an ambitious commander. He'd been the victor at the Battle of Saratoga a few years previously, a great revolutionary success. And he now believed that one more success like that might allow him to take George Washington's job as the Revolution's top soldier. So he forced his men down this road, hard marching. The men were on starvation rations, and what they did eat was making them sick. They had dysentery, diarrhea, they were in a poor condition. But he thought he was heading for a British outpost at Camden, that if he marched quick enough and achieved enough surprise, would fall into his control. What he didn't know was that loyalist spies in this area had reported to British forces way down in Charleston. Cornwallis, the British commander in the southern colonies, had gathered his veterans together and marched an incredible 100 miles in 3 days to reach Camden before the American revolutionaries. Cornwallis's entire British army was now heading north out of Camden to try and halt the American advance. Around 2 a.m, the inevitable happened. The scouts or pickets of either army crashed into each other in the darkness. There was a skirmish and both sides stopped to try and work out what was going on. When Gates heard the news that he was facing the full might of the army of South Carolina under the command of Cornwallis, he appeared stunned. He held a council of war and simply said, "Gentlemen, what is to be done?" No one answered. No one wanted to give the obvious answer, which is retreat. Eventually, one of his advisors said, "All we can do is fight." Gates nodded grimly. As August the 16th dawned, battle seemed inevitable. By the time the sun came up, this is around about where the British Army decided to deploy. They pushed out their flanks either side of the road, extended in long lines, ready to do battle with the Americans that were scrambling to deploy opposite them. This would be quite a conventional 18th century battle. Two armies facing each other in long lines, a bit of artillery in the middle, but the plan was to fire musket volleys at each other and then close with the bayonet, hand-to-hand fighting, try and break the resolve of the other side to stand, send them fleeing. I've got a great map here that was actually a contemporary map, just drawn up after the battle. And it does show all the dispositions really well. You've got the road here running along the middle of the battlefield, the men deploying on either side of it, the British regulars over here, the redcoat professional regulars over on the right. There's a bit of a tradition at the time, not always followed, that you put your senior units at the right of your line, which means that you end up in a situation where your most effective units face some of the enemy's least experienced, and that's certainly what happens at this battle. So the British here, you've got Webster here, British regular officer, with units, redcoat units, hardened veterans. You have very interesting units here. You have these American-raised British units. So they're British Army units, but raised in America, loyalist British Army units, and then just a little bit further back, the cavalry waiting to pounce. They can transform a battle in a second. Now, deploying out there through the trees, the Brits would have seen the American revolutionaries, their enemies. On this side of the road, the British faced militiamen from North Carolina, from Virginia. These were part-time soldiers. They were farmers, they were civilians, and they'd enrolled perhaps for the course of one campaign or for a limited amount of time. They weren't hugely effective soldiers. They might know how to use a musket, but we hear that some of these men had never been shown how to attach a bayonet, the sharpened knife of steel, onto the end of their musket, and they certainly didn't know how to use them in battle. On this side of the road, you get the American Revolutionary professionals, the Continental soldiers who'd served under George Washington, who'd signed up to form the first American professional army. They were effective soldiers under their commander DeKalb, bringing his knowledge from European battlefields. This is just a snapshot of the dispositions moments before the fighting began. And on here it looks so clear, but of course actually it would have been a chaotic, noisy, overwhelming scene. You have units marching up here, kicking up dust with their feet, the horses' hooves, trying to deploy on either side of this road, people shouting about maintaining their dressing, making sure there's one coherent line. You'd have had some drumming, you'd have the shouting of officers, messengers galloping about on horses. You'd have sergeants quietly having a word with perhaps some of the younger, less steady men, reminding them of their duty, reminding them to hold their fire till the last minute. The key was to get a musket volley in at close range and then close with bayonets. You didn't want inexperienced men firing off in terror when the ranges were too far. And on the far side, you have General Gates playing no real role in the battle. He was way too far back, and definitely with one eye on his escape route. Eventually, the order came to advance. The British quickly took the initiative, especially the professional, highly experienced units on their right flank. Over here on the eastern side of the battlefield, the British Redcoat veterans closed fast with the Americans. They moved up, they fired a volley with their muskets at very close range, and then they set about them with their bayonets. These were hundreds of battle-hardened soldiers amongst the farmers of the North Carolina and Virginia militia. And the Americans fled. They were underfed, they were exhausted, they had diarrhea, they hadn't received the correct training, and now one of the finest infantry units in the world was bearing down upon them. The American militia crumbled, breaking ranks as the first shots were fired and the British charge began. They fled north, some hiding in the marshes. The whole left side of the American line had collapsed in an instant. It was a rout. It's at this point, though, that you really get a sense of the professionalism of the British Army. Because rather than all these teenage boys with muskets chasing after their fleeing American enemy, they maintained their cohesion, they listened to their officers, and the order came to wheel to the left. And that meant they were now in a line at right angles to their original line of advance. And they started moving to the centre, pressing in on the Americans along the line here. The American reserves tried to move forward to block this pincer move, but this was near impossible in the chaos of battle. You've got to remember also at this point that as soon as the guns started firing, the smoke from the gunpowder of muskets and cannon, it was a very still day, and the air was thick with smoke, so it was very unclear what was going on. And that meant these Americans, who had been focused on the redcoats in front of them, now had the terrifying prospect of being caught between two jaws of the British Army, the ones advancing up here and the ones coming at them from their left flank. In the 1990s, archaeologists started to explore the battlefield following discoveries by relic hunters. It culminated in a series of major excavations in the fall of 2022, when several shallow graves were carefully exhumed by archaeologists and forensic experts.
The way we have it now with that map is it going like that, which would mean that all that's part of
The aim was to record, examine and preserve the remains prior to reburial. Remarkable discoveries were made, like this flint from the firing mechanism of a flintlock musket. White flags now show the edges of the graves. I've come to the centre of the battlefield, where the more experienced revolutionary forces put up a very strong fight. Steve Smith has been involved in much of the research. He's taking me to the site of a particularly interesting burial of a Scottish soldier fighting in the British Army. Steve, what's this depression here with these markings?
Well, this is the exact location where we found the 71st Highlander. And the orange pole that's sticking up there marks where his head was, and the green pole marks where his legs or feet were.
How did we come across these bodies? Were they disturbed by treasure hunters or animals, or did you know where to look?
In this case, the first one, this gentleman here, was found by a relic collector. Others that we found were found by us doing systematic archaeological work here using metal detectors.
And how do we know that this gentleman here in this grave was a 71st Highlander, a Brit?
He had plenty of 71st Highlander buttons on him.
Okay, so the buttons are key.
The buttons are key.
As well as the 71st Highland Regiment buttons, the excavations of this burial also revealed this metalwork, complete with a Scottish thistle insignia and the number 71. The plan of the excavation shows how the Highlander was laid out carefully in the grave. What does the manner of burial tell us about this gentleman?
Well, we recovered 14 soldiers, 12 Continentals, a militiaman, and this British Highlander. This was the only individual that was buried formally, laid out as you would if you knew the gentleman and you wanted to pay him respects. This gentleman was buried the deepest of all of the 14. He was about 1.5 feet deep, whereas the other soldiers that we recovered were all just kind of thrown in shallow graves. In fact, one individual we found after we began excavating him we found that his femurs were actually sticking up out of the ground, and in very shallow graves, again, and just tossed in any old house, so to speak.
So I guess that reflects the Brits are in charge of the battlefield. They retain possession of the field after the fighting,
Correct.
so they look after their own.
Correct, exactly. One of these, I'm sure this gentleman was buried by some of his friends.
And from these bodies, can we tell anything about the manner in which they died?
Well, the Highlander had a severe impact to his back of his cranium. It's believed it's probably blunt force trauma, so he probably was killed by a hard blow to the back of his skull.
So like a blow from the butt of a musket or something, so that real hand-to-hand.
Absolutely. We're in the middle of a thick battle with very violent fighting between 23rd British soldiers, the 71st Highlanders, and the 1st Maryland Brigade.
All of them veterans, they knew what they were doing.
Yeah, these were not amateurs. These were people who had been through a lot already, and they were hardcore veterans. So this was violent warfare right here.
What other archaeology have you done on the battlefield? Have you done metal detecting, remote sensing that can tell you any more about the fighting?
Yes, that's correct. That's our primary effort here, is to do systematic metal detecting across the entire battlefield. Every artifact we have a GPS point for. You could come into our lab and say, I'd like to know exactly where that musket ball found, and we can go, okay, we put it in the GPS, come right back out here and go, that's where we found it.
And can I see the results of that?
Oh yes, absolutely. So here is one of our latest maps.
Wow.
And you can see all of these are musket balls or buckshot.
So we're standing in pretty much the densest concentration of musket ball drops here.
That's correct. There's hardcore fighting going on here. These are either drop musket balls, or they're from both the British and the Americans, or they're buckshot fired from American cartridge. And there's a few gun parts and that sort of thing.
Is the suggestion here these are actually musket balls that shot and fell to the ground, or were they fumbled as people were reloading their muskets and just dropped out of pockets
That's correct.
and pouches?
Some of these are balls that have been, we call them unfired, because we don't know if they were dropped or how they got there, but they're basically unfired. But you're right, we can extract out all the fired muskets and look at the unfired musket balls and be able to refine where we know units were. Because if you got a line of unfired musket balls, then you've got an indication that someone was standing there in a row with other British or American soldiers firing volleys downrange.
And so let's take a look at this. What do you think it's telling us? Clearly there's a big fight down here where the American Continentals took on the British American raised troops. That was the battle ebbed and flowed there.
That's correct. What you're pointing at is the American right flank and the British left. And so the 2nd Maryland Brigade was fighting here against the North Carolina Loyalists and the Volunteers of Ireland. On the other side of this road, out here was where the Virginia militia and the North Carolina militia were. Of course, they fled from the battlefield.
Not many musket balls there, so maybe nothing lasted too long there.
The Virginia militia fled almost immediately as they saw the British regulars coming forward with their bayonets. They just simply took off. And then the 2nd Maryland Brigade, which was in reserve, came forward, met the 23rd and the 33rd, and then slowly were forced back. And this is where this heavy fighting is going on.
And that's why the sense almost of a right angle here.
Correct.
Because the Brits are coming in from here and from here.
Correct.
Okay.
It's like a backward J.
Yeah.
And what happened was the British General, Lord Cornwallis, saw the gap between those two battles that were going on, sent in his 71st Highlanders and British Cavalry, the British Legion Cavalry, and British Legion Cavalry were able to get behind the Americans on this right flank, and then they realized they were being surrounded, and that's when they had to fall back.
So this is our 71st man here was perhaps sent into battle by Cornwallis slightly after the rest as a kind of to administer the coup de grace.
Absolutely. He was a reserve. He came in later in the battle, but he got all the way up here. So he made it this far forward.
Approximately how many artifacts and musket balls and other projectiles do you think you found on the battlefield?
Oh, we've just counted recently. We've got 2,900 musket balls.
Many men fell in a short period of time in this area of the battlefield. Just 100 feet from the 71st Highlanders' grave lies another more complex burial of what appear to be revolutionary soldiers. Working alongside the team from the University of South Carolina are expert forensic anthropologists Bill Stevens and Maddie Atwell from the Richland County Coroner's Office. So this looks like a more complicated site, a lot more markers here, Bill. What was under the ground when you had a look here?
Maddie and I were excavating across the road. Archaeologists were here. They were troweling away, carefully brushing, and we soon realized this was potentially a mass grave. The heads, the skull location is marked by the orange flags, and the feet are the green markers.
And so, Maddie, this looks like it's a mass grave, but also quite concentrated. They're not all kind of spread out.
So these individuals were commingled. This side was less commingled than this. This consisted of about 3 people who were very much overlaying each other. And so it took Bill and I a couple hours of sitting and just looking and taking a color-coded map and sketch to figure out which skeletal element belonged with each individual to ensure that we were maintaining anatomical orientation of every individual.
So it sounds like these gentlemen were sort of thrown in a pretty haphazard way. Does that reflect the attitude, do you think, after the battle of the victors towards the vanquished?
Potentially it does. What stood out in this grave particularly were fractured femurs. So we have kind of a locus that was commingled here with broken bones, suggesting rough handling of the soldiers, contrasting with some of the other graves. Hastily thrown in. There's lots of factors at play. The August heat, men were not well. They were suffering from dysentery and battle wounds. So this was done hastily and in a rough manner. The potential throwing of the bodies on top of each other is a sign they were not given much respect. They could have been buried by the victors of the battle, just with nowhere near the care, just 100 feet away of the Highlander.
Other than the manner in which they appear to have been buried without that respect, what other clues do we have that these were Continentals, these were American Revolutionary troops?
Yeah, this is based on the archaeology done at the site that has been able to identify everybody by their buttons. So the buttons had USA on them, and Jim Legg, the archaeologist, is able, even in their very fragmented state, to put them back together in a really amazing way.
What can we tell about the way they may have lived?
Their dental enamel preserves signs of nutritional stress, maybe fever-producing illness as children. So these are ubiquitous among 18th, 19th century samples, usually evidence of growth disruption, linear defects of the enamel, growth stoppages revealed by X-ray of their shin bones, their tibia. So they had tough childhoods and nutritional challenges.
So even before they joined up to serve in this brutal war, they would have had a very tough life.
They would have, yes.
And do we have any causes of death?
We are always hesitant to make assessments of cause of death when we only have fragmentary skeletons, so we document traumatic injury. So we have associations of musket balls directly with the bone. So those we document as projectile injuries. A lot of the preservation out here did not lead to survival of elements like the ribs and the vertebrae because they're porous bone. So in not surviving, the evidence we have for their potential injuries and causes of death are projectiles within their abdominal cavity.
Maddie, you must have, in your job as a coroner, you look at all sorts of different causes of death and sites. Is there something really different about working in a battlefield where you've got like massed casualties like this?
Right, where everybody is pretty much a homicide. Yeah, the difference for me, although it's absolutely still emotional, is it's not contemporary medical legal death investigation. So it was a real honor to figure out more information about these individuals where there really isn't a lot of the physiological, the biological aspect involved in the historical canon that already exists.
During the intense fighting to the east of the road, on the west side, the revolutionary troops were rallied by General de Kalb. desperately trying to stage a fighting retreat. A further grave has revealed 3 Continental soldiers who were struck down during this. They were all teenagers. Musket balls were again found amongst the bones. General de Kalb and his men attempted to drop back in stages, but now they were surrounded. The British cavalry swooped round to their rear. In this wooded area, the general fell, alongside troops of all ranks and ages. He was mortally wounded, one of the most senior officers to die in the whole War of Independence. The bones of the fallen, discovered here on the battlefield, have now been exhumed and placed in coffins, ready for a very special and unusual commemoration ceremony. In charge of organising it is Doug Bostic of the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust.
You and your organisation have organised a big event here. It's a world-class project in terms of the preservation of the battlefield, the forensics. Why go to so much trouble?
Well, at the outset, frankly, a lot of people said, Doug, you're just crazy to take this on. But I was so determined that we needed to do this. We're now on the cusp of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And that's just an opportunity that is worthy of honoring them in a remarkable way.
I don't think I've ever been invited to an 18th century military funeral before. You're pioneering something quite new here.
It is, but we want it to be an affair that, while they'd be shocked at all the attention they're receiving, we want it to be something that for them would be recognizable. One of the quotes that we found that we've been enamored with since the beginning of this project is from General Schwarzkopf, the United States Army, and he famously said, "The heroes are not the generals that order men into battle, the heroes are the men that follow orders and go into battle."
And so we're remembering those men who fought on the front line tomorrow.
We're determined to honor the common soldier. We're not here to represent Horatio Gates, Lord Cornwallis, Otho Hallam Williams, Bannister Tarleton. We're here to honor the men that followed those orders and sacrificed for their own country, whichever one that was.
Over the last few days, Camden has seen extensive preparations. Revolutionary-era stars and stripes adorn the streets, and it seems that most of the city is turning out for the ceremony.
It's Saturday morning here in Camden. We've had a few showers, but the skies are clearing now, which is good because anticipation is building. The crowds are gathering. The roads have been shut because in just a few minutes' time, the funeral cortege of those 14 Revolutionary War soldiers will be passing by here on their way to the funeral.
There's just time to catch up with some of the crowd to find out what this means to the people of Camden.
Why do you think it's important that we remember our history?
Well, it really defines who we are as a country, and we can't move forward without remembering what happened in the beginning. And I think we do good to remember exactly why we are where we are today.
What's your name, sir?
Levi.
Nice to meet you, Levi. How are you doing?
Nathan.
Nathan, are you guys from Camden?
We are.
What brings you down here today?
Well, we're here to see the, what do you call it?
Funeral procession.
Yeah, we're here to see that because one of my teachers told me about it.
I teach social studies, U.S. history in high school.
So you're the local history teacher in high school?
One of them, yeah.
We hear a lot today that the kids, they want to learn STEM subjects. And do you think events like this are going to just re-engage people with history a bit and make your life a bit easier and tell the kids why they should be studying history?
Well, you have to make it relevant to them. And Thursday, they brought all the remains by the schools on Humvees with flag-draped coffins. And when I related to them, the two of the sets of remains they aged them between 14 and 16 years old. That really hit a lot of them because that's their age. And, you know, they were fighting? Yes, you know, and that really shocked them. A lot of people don't really understand, or when in high school, when they learn about the Northern Campaign,
yeah.
You know, Bunker Hill and all those battles. But the war was really won down here in the Southern Campaign. Although Camden was a major defeat for the American forces down. The second major defeat with the fall of Charleston.
Yeah. But it was a key part of that journey.
Right, yes.
So this is the big moment. Here they come, led by an American military band, where you can see the horse-drawn wagons and the gun carriages coming up, each with a soldier who fell at Camden on it. Here come the first of the wagons with the fallen Americans on them, each topped by an American flag. Now carrying the fallen, and behind them here we have the British contingent. Here is the British veteran, Scottish veteran, on a gun carriage with the Royal Regiment of Scotland accompanying. The Royal Regiment of Scotland is the modern unit that carries the heritage of all of the Scottish units of the British Army past, whether it's the Black Watch or the Highland Light Infantry. They carry the traditions, they carry the battle honours of predecessor regiments like the 71st Highlanders, and it's amazing to see that link between a unit 240 years ago and serving members of today's army.
Reenactors, representing both sides of the battle, carry their muskets in reverse out of respect for the fallen. The procession eventually arrives in front of the Bethesda Presbyterian Church. In its grounds lies the burial of General Johann de Kalb. But today's service is all about the ordinary soldiers from the ranks who fell in the battle, men who did not receive proper burial at the time. It strikes a chord with the serving soldiers present.
Joel, what's it mean to be here today as a serving soldier?
Sir, being here today, it's a true honor and a privilege to not only be here amongst our greatest ally and our local population, and to see our soldiers and serve today to recognize our fallen, regardless of how long it's taken.
I can be guilty of thinking about the kind of archaeology, but actually for you, this is something that you've experienced. You've lost men in battle.
Yeah, well, we have done, so it's not lost on us that we have soldiers in our regiment who have paid the ultimate sacrifice in recent operations. And if you have a look at the pallbearers, every single one of them have got medals on their chest from recent campaigns in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kosovo. So as much as we're here today and to lay to rest a soldier who died almost 250 years ago, ultimately our thoughts will also be with soldiers from our own regiment who have died in recent campaigns.
We want to give thanks for their courage and their conviction and service, because in the midst of the darkness and the conflict that took place 9 miles away from here, and in the haste to keep moving and keep going because of the threat of imprisonment or death, these men were not given their due respect. And so, out of gratitude, we are here from worship today to give thanks to God and to honor them.
At the end of the service, the coffins are prepared to return to the battlefield.
Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord.
North of Camden, the convoy arrives back in the woods that once echoed with battle.
Order! Order!
Soldiers are making the final stage of their journey back here to Camden battlefield, where they'll be reinterred and where they'll remain.
Unto himself the souls of our dear brothers here departed. We therefore commit their bodies to
The coffins, carrying the remains of the men who died here on August the 16th, 1780, are lined up for full military honours. First, the American Revolutionary soldiers received their tribute. A solitary piper plays a lament to mark the lone Scottish dead. Watching this reminds you that men came from near and far to fight this battle in 1780. A single day of combat, whilst being an American defeat, played its part in the story of American victory in a war that changed history.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.